Norfolk police are appealing for calm following 3 nights of anti-immigrant unrest in Thetford. The quiet market town has seen violence and disorder this past week as anti-immigrant protesters attempted to enter properties suspected of housing asylum seekers, with frightened families escorted away by police. 4 people have been arrested and 2 police officers were taken to hospital, including one who had been bitten. Well, Kevin Foster is a former Conservative immigration minister, and I'm delighted to say he joins me now. Good afternoon, Kevin.
Good afternoon.
Thanks so much for making some time to speak to us, Kevin. Kevin, these are quite disturbing stories that we're hearing out of Thetford. What do you make of the violence and the disorder we've seen this week?
Yeah, they are concerning. Let's be clear, you don't make any reasonable point about migration policy or what should happen at the border in Dover by attacking your local police, and unequivocally condemn any violence like this. And it's right that those people involved will be dealt with by the courts. But what perhaps this talks about is we've seen recently the announcement of a large accommodation centre in West Suffolk, but actually not very far away at all from Thetford, if you look at the actual geography, and of course the ongoing debates about migration more widely. Plus, with the government pledging to move people out of hotels, one of the things that perhaps hasn't been realised is a lot of people think that means people are then being moved abroad, being removed from the country. Actually, what we've seen is a growth in what's called dispersed accommodation, which is effectively housing people in houses in local communities. When there was a recent Home Affairs Select Committee in the House of Commons, it was revealed they'd found another 5,000 places like that in recent months. So you'll be seeing more people being placed in local communities rather than, let's say, hotels or bigger accommodation centres, and that will inevitably bring some tensions, as actually any HIMO accommodation does. That's why many councils licence them.
OK, Kevin, so where should asylum seekers be housed? I mean, there was unhappiness with them being housed in hotels. So, as you say, in Thetford, they've been housed in HMOs, houses of multiple occupation. Those have been targeted. We've got these protests about them moving into a former RAF base outside Thetford. We have asylum seekers and they need accommodation. What's your proposal? Where do we put them?
Well, Jane, I was one of the ones who originally worked on having larger accommodation centres. I can remember, for example, taking a lot of criticism from the then Labour Party around places like Linton-on-Ouse and Scampton. And now, of course, Linton-on-Ouse is coming back via the Labour Party having reconsidered its stance on larger accommodation centres. But, no immigration minister is going to make themselves popular by announcing any form of accommodation in any local community. Hotels can become a focal point for protests and disquiet, and local authorities don't like them, in particular the fact that what's supposed to be temporary holiday accommodation, or perhaps for me or you staying for a couple of nights on business, becomes a sort of permanent accommodation, which is not really designed for. Or, for example, local housing, in terms of particularly the type of accommodation the Home Office's providers rent out, is actually sometimes the type of accommodation local authorities are looking for to fulfil their own housing duties. So there's no easy options on this. There's no popular wins, and no one can. I remember once having explained under Sunak's administration when they thought using, for example, student accommodation might be popular, having to explain to them, there are no easy wins, no popular proposals here. You've got a legal duty and you're up against a necessity to provide accommodation if people are eligible for it.
Yeah, so basically whatever accommodation asylum seekers are put in, you're basically saying somebody will protest about that.
Absolutely. Look, no one's going to thank the immigration minister. It's the one ministerial job, perhaps short of being minister dealing with things like refuse disposal, those sorts of planning decisions that whenever you phone a local MP and say, this is the Home Office facility is going to go into your constituency, regardless, has to be said, of party, no one's going to thank you for that one. But it all comes to, I think, the wider discussion about how do you stop the issues at the border? How do you reduce the near record numbers applying for asylum in this country, and actually not just people arriving in small boats, but people who have come on student visas and then apply for asylum at the end of it, potentially as an alternative to making the legitimate immigration applications they should be in to save themselves some money. That's where a lot is covered. And I think a lot of it see with the objections and the concerns across the country, not just in Thetford. Is people just frustrated that there's this issue in Dover? Mr. Sunak said stop the boats. Keir Starmer said smash the gangs. People are now waiting to see what does Andy Burnham actually do about this, because that's where it comes. One thing I will welcome Andy Burnham is he has decided not to come up with yet another 3-word slogan.
Yeah.
But I think now it's going to be what is his actual solutions to that problem, because that's how you end some of these issues of asylum accommodation, of course, is not having a regular stream of people entering the country illegally.
Yeah, absolutely. 3-word slogans aren't going to solve that. Absolutely, Kevin. Kevin, when the Tories were in government for 14 years, I mean, you were unable to get channel crossings under control, as well as you were mentioning, the surges in work and study visas as well. And the asylum backlog did soar, which is part of the problem that we're seeing now, with the numbers of people waiting to be processed still. Do you think Andy Burnham might be more successful in dealing with that?
Well, it's worth noting numbers were falling at the of channel crossings until July 2024, and then went up again, and now started to fall back to where they were in 2024. I obviously hope Andy Burnham is successful. I want to see this problem resolved. My goal isn't in life to score points and point out problems. I'd really like to see a government really get to grips with it and solve the problem. But where it will need to be is to look at, it has to be a wider strategy, and that does mean looking at countries like Australia, looking at the United States, which had a big issue at its southern border 3-4 years ago, and now that has been resolved. But there's
resolved by with some pretty violent means to quote unquote solve those, Kevin. I mean, are you really advocating borrowing some of the policies from America? Kids in cages, separation of families.
Well, the government already is borrowing quite a number of policies from the United States. And also, let's look at Europe as well, actually. Germany has started returns to Afghanistan for the first time since the Taliban takeover. Now, that's a European country signed up to the ECHR, and for very obvious historical reasons, very strong domestic protections of human rights.
I don't mean to keep interrupting you, Kevin, but are you saying that we should be sending people back to Afghanistan with the Taliban in charge? I mean, if you were to read Anthony Lloyd's incredible piece today about the morality police, patrolling Afghanistan, doing all sorts of things to women who aren't wearing the right burqa.
Yes, Jane, if you commit serious criminal offence here in this country, why shouldn't you be returned to Afghanistan? I think many people in the public think that's perfectly reasonable. Germany has signed up to all the sorts of human rights and international obligations. They've done it. We expect other European Union countries to follow. So, yes, I've got no problem with saying, particularly criminals should be returned to Afghanistan. If it's not a high bar to set, but if you come to this country seeking sanctuary, that we ask you not to commit criminal offences. That's really not a high bar to set.
What numbers of asylum seekers go on to commit criminal offences in this country, Kevin? It's a pretty small minority.
I think
that's not going to really effectively cut the numbers, is it?
Well, Jane, one of the things we all would love to see would be actually detailed breakdowns being published of criminality by nationality, which would give that sort of information. But certainly other countries that have done it, there is certain nationalities that have a higher criminal offending rate. That's just a fact in terms of particularly around things like sexual offending. By the way, there's also some migrant communities that come to the UK that actually commit less offences than UK nationals. I think Japanese citizens is an example of one. And there's some countries overseas, I think Finland's one, where actually UK nationals have a far lower crime rate than domestic citizens.
But we don't get an awful lot of asylum seekers from Scandinavia or Japan, do we?
No, we don't. We refuse those because, of course, there's no need to claim asylum from a Scandinavian country, very obviously. But
Kevin, we're running a little bit short of time. We're running a little bit short of time, and I don't want to get into the weeds with you about returns to Afghanistan, because I do want. You mentioned Europe, and I do think there's a very interesting situation happening in Europe, which we're watching from afar. In Ceuta, where 72,000 people crossed from Morocco just over a week ago into the Spanish territory. There's been reports this week that allege that online chat groups are fueling fears of another migrant surge into Ceuta. It sparked hostility between Italy and Spain, destabilising European relations in terms of Schengen. What do you make of the situation there? And is there a problem with nefarious forces encouraging such surges, potentially for political gain?
Yeah, Jane, I think it's hard to believe that thousands of people suddenly spontaneously all went to the border and decided to do something together. There was clearly some organisation going on the back, and it does show the risk to borders like Ceuta of if someone coordinates large numbers to suddenly storm the fence, it's very little that the border authorities there can do. And I'm not going to advocate a resort to using live ammunition, things like that, or where people are unarmed. So it does seem to have been a worrying level of coordination. migration. Also, of course, 100 people have died given the way people were crossing. That is a tragic part of this. But it does expose a tension in Europe's immigration policy, particularly around Schengen. That unlike the Eurozone, where there's very strict rules around what you can do financially if you're part of the Euro, you can still have very different immigration policies and be part of the border-free Schengen area. That's why the UK didn't join it while it was in the EU. And so you've got Pedro Sanchez giving status to illegal migrants, whereas Giorgia Meloni in Italy wants to remove them. And that creates an inherent tension as it goes forward about how do you maintain an open border if someone can have such radically different migration policies, whatever particular choice you take on them.
Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It's great to speak to you, Kevin. We appreciate it. That is Kevin Foster, who is a former Conservative immigration minister.